The water came over the rail in black sheets, and for a moment no one on deck could tell which way was up. Somewhere below, men prayed to saints they had never much believed in before that night. The ship groaned like something alive and dying at once, its single mast bending under a wind that had not stopped screaming for 6 hours. Nobody aboard had charts for these waters. Nobody had names for these currents. Some of them believed, quietly, that the ocean simply ended somewhere out here, that the horizon was not a line but an edge, and that ships which crossed it did not sink so much as fall. And yet they had chosen this. They had walked onto this ship, under this captain, toward this darkness on purpose. To understand why a man would gamble his life against a rumor of gold and pepper, you first have to understand what Europe had become by the middle of the 15th century and what it had lost. For generations, the spices that flavored Europe's food, preserved its meat through winter, and perfumed its churches, traveled an impossibly long road. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from the Malabar coast, nutmeg from islands most Europeans could not have located on any map, passed through the hands of Arab traders, Persian merchants, and Italian middlemen in Venice and Genoa before reaching a noble's table. Every hand that touched those goods added a price. By the time cloves reached the kitchen in Lisbon or London, they had changed owners a dozen times and cost more, ounce for ounce, than silver. Silk, porcelain, precious stones followed similar invisible roads out of Asia. Europe wanted what the East produced, and Europe controlled almost none of the routes that carried it. Then, in 1453, the ground shifted. Constantinople, the last great fragment of the Roman world, fell to Ottoman forces after a siege that stunned Christendom. The city had stood as a gateway between East and West for over 1,000 years. Its fall did not slam every door to Asian trade shut overnight, but it tightened the grip on routes that already ran through hostile or heavily taxed territory. Merchants in Lisbon, in Seville, in the trading houses of Italy began to ask a question that would define the coming century. If the old road east was closing, was there another way to reach the same riches? If you were a European ruler in these years, watching your treasury drain into foreign hands with every shipment of pepper, wouldn't you have wondered the same thing? Portugal answered first. Along its rocky southern coast, a prince who would be remembered as Henry the Navigator, though he himself rarely sailed, began funding something new: repeated, systematic voyages down the unmapped coast of West Africa. He gathered cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and sailors at Sagres, and he sent them out again and again, past the point where earlier sailors had turned back in terror. Legend held that beyond Cape Bojador, the sea boiled, the sun scorched men black, and monsters waded in the deep. For years, captains obeyed that fear. Henry funded expedition after expedition until, in 1434, Gil Eanes finally rounded the Cape and returned alive, unburned, unchanged. The myth cracked. And once it cracked, the coast of Africa opened before Portuguese ships like a door no one had realized was unlocked. None of this would have been possible without a quiet revolution in the tools sailors carried. The caravel, small, fast, and rigged with lateen sails that could catch wind from difficult angles, let captains sail closer to the coastline and tack against headwinds that would have stopped older, heavier vessels cold. The magnetic compass, refined and carried as standard equipment, gave sailors direction when clouds swallowed the stars. The astrolabe let them measure the angle of the sun or a known star and calculate their latitude, however roughly, on an ocean with no landmarks at all. And porcelain charts, dense with compass lines and coastal detail, preserved hard-won knowledge of currents and hazards, so the next captain would not have to relearn a coastline by nearly dying on it. Imagine standing on a heaving deck at night with only a wooden disc and the stars to tell you where on earth you were. That was navigation in the 1400s. Everything else was faith. Life aboard these ships offered little comfort to balance the risk. Crews of a few dozen men crowded into hulls that reeked of bilgewater, tar, and unwashed bodies for months at a time. Food spoiled, water turned foul in its casks, scurvy crept in slowly, loosening teeth and blackening gums, though sailors did not yet understand why. Storms could shred sails and snap masts in minutes, and a ship damaged far from any known port faced a very real chance that no one would ever know what became of it. Wives and children in Lisbon and Porto said goodbye to men who might be gone for a year or gone forever, with no way to send word home either way. If you had stood on that dock, watching a ship you couldn't afford to insure sail toward a coastline no map could confirm, would you have gone? Would you have let someone you loved go? The Portuguese pushed steadily south along Africa's coast for decades, trading, mapping, and occasionally clashing with the kingdoms and communities they encountered. Each voyage added a little more coastline to the charts and a little more confidence that the ocean had an end after all. That confidence was tested and answered in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias, driven far off course by a violent storm, found himself rounding the southern tip of Africa without ever having seen it, and realized upon turning north again that the coast now ran the wrong way. He had found the bottom of the continent. The sea route to India, the one that could bypass every Ottoman toll and every Venetian middleman, suddenly seemed within reach. If a well-researched voyage into the unknown grips you the way it gripped sailors 4 centuries ago, this is exactly the kind of history worth staying for. Spain, watching Portugal's African gains with growing unease, gambled on a different theory entirely. Christopher Columbus, convinced the Earth's circumference was far smaller than most scholars believed, proposed sailing due west to reach Asia. Rejected repeatedly, he finally won the backing of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. He did not reach Asia. He reached lands entirely unknown to European maps, encountering peoples and continents whose existence would force every scholar in Europe to reconsider what the world actually contained. Columbus never fully accepted what he had found. Within years, others, including John Cabot sailing for England, pushed further into these unclaimed Atlantic waters, each voyage adding another impossible shape to a rapidly rewritten map. By the century's end, Portugal and Spain stood locked in fierce rivalry over the new worlds their sailors had opened, each claiming routes and lands the other coveted, each funding fleet after fleet in a race that would reshape trade, empire, and the very borders of the known world. Kings who had once measured wealth in inherited land now measured it in ships at sea and coastlines yet unmapped. And it all began with men willing to sail past the edge of every chart they owned, into a darkness that could have swallowed them whole, chasing a horizon that, for all any of them truly knew, might never have ended at all.